Thank you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your willingness to serve and for your sacrifice. Let me start with you, Mr. Nathan. The United States needs a long-term development finance strategy for the Pacific. DFC has been given a set of new tools to meet the needs of our partners in the Pacific, and I get that not every worthy project will pencil out, but we can collaborate with our partners in the Pacific that are also financing projects in the region to do more to support economic growth with less risk to the taxpayer. Can you talk about where the opportunities are for DFC to use newer financing products, use newer techniques like technical assistance, feasibility studies to expand our development work in the Pacific?
Yes, thanks for the question and for the conversation we had about this subject in preparation for the hearing. The BUILD Act gave the DFC new tools and expanded authorities. As you mentioned, technical assistance is one of them in order to prepare countries which may not have the enabling environment to accept investment. We also were given the equity investment tool, which gives much more flexibility and the possibility of going out on the risk spectrum for making investments. So the BUILD Act has given DFC tools to make important and impactful investments in the region and elsewhere.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important that DFC step up its commitment on climate-focused development as part of the mission, particularly in the Pacific?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, the climate crisis impacts the developing world and the people who live there greatly, potentially more than anywhere else in the globe. It's important to find projects that are climate-linked, which could include smart agriculture, water systems, in addition to power generation, so that these countries are prepared for dealing with the climate crisis.
Thank you. Ambassador Brzezinski, we've seen backsliding with the Polish government, particularly on press freedom. Reporters Without Borders has cautioned that the government is pushing for greater state control of the media by censoring private outlets or forcing to close those who won't comply. Can you talk about what you will do to elevate press freedom?
Thank you. First of all, we will speak directly with the Polish government regarding the importance of press freedom and human rights generally. I mean, I come as an ambassador with a very clear message. America embraces equality. And that will be something that U.S. Embassy Warsaw will absolutely project and has been over the many generations of U.S. ambassadors that have been there before me. I've been watching with concern what you report, Senator, about democratic backsliding. It is important to stress that Poland's role as a NATO ally is partly about its keeping its commitments, not just militarily, but as Senator Menendez said earlier, about its commitments on values. There are international commitments for Poland to keep as a NATO member, as an EU member, and as an upcoming chair of the OSCE. And so we will be watching that closely. And then lastly, there's the self-interest associated with the business angle. Business is attracted to places characterized by legal certainty. Places that are more legally certain attract more business. And that's something that's relevant to both Americans and Poles. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Ambassador Bass, a lot of routine consular services were either canceled or moved online. And, you know, you briefly mentioned this earlier during the hearing, but I'd like you to flesh out where you think some of the changes that were made that were temporary ought to be made permanent, and what other kinds of technologies and processes ought to be explored in order to move the State Department and consular services in particular into the information age.
Thanks, Senator. You know, from my perspective, one of the most important things we do is provide those services to American citizens in issuing passports and facilitating business travel and tourism to the States through visa services. We've gotten, I think, more agile in identifying where we have excess supply, if you will, capacity to support high demand embassies. So we're now doing quite a bit more remote adjudication. We're continuing to explore ways to reduce the range of people for whom an in-person appearance is required, so that we're only really focusing on interviewing those people who are particularly high risk or for other reasons come to mind like that. And we're looking at...
Are these permanent changes that are, or do you anticipate these being permanent changes? Are these precipitated in part by the pandemic, or was this already underway? Give me a sense for where we are, and I guess give me some reassurance that we're not going to snap back to the old way where everyone has to stand in line and wait to get a stamp.
So these are changes that have come about as adaptations to the limitations due to the pandemic, and we're currently in the process of looking at which of those we can apply as best practices and standardizing them going forward. And if I'm confirmed, very much intent on doing as much of that as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations, excuse me, to each of you on your nominations, and